Every year, thousands of people see unidentified flying objects in the sky. Are these people having hallucinations? Or are these UFOs visitors from another planet? Nearly half of all Americans believe that UFOs really are extraterrestrials. But is there any credible evidence to actually prove this claim? The world's leading UFO researchers, Jacques Vallée, J. Allen Hynek, along with many other scientists, have investigated the credibility of UFO reports. And their findings agree. About 95% of all UFO sightings can be accounted for as either man-made objects or natural phenomena. Weather balloons, the planet Venus, atmospheric events, military aircraft, and even clever hoaxes are often reported as UFOs. But experts also agree that a residual number of UFO sightings defy natural explanations. These residual UFOs, or RUFOs, make up roughly 5% of all UFO reports. What are these RUFOs? Could they be aliens from another planet? Are they some type of top-secret military aircraft? How can these sightings be explained? These questions and more will be addressed as we develop the RUFO hypothesis.
Welcome to this special edition of Reasons to Believe. In this video series, we're going to discuss many questions surrounding the mystery of UFOs. I'm your host, Greg Kokel, and I'm joined today by astronomer, minister, and UFO investigator, Dr. Hugh Ross. Dr. Ross has a PhD in astrophysics from the University of Toronto in Canada and has written several best-selling books about the interface between science and Christianity, including The Creator and the Cosmos and Beyond the Cosmos. Welcome, Hugh.
Thank you. And Greg, I'm really glad that we're addressing this in question. It's one of the most frequently asked questions we get.
Well, joining us, cult researcher and Christian theologian and philosopher, Mr. Kenneth Samples. Welcome, Ken.
Hi, Greg. It's good to be with you and Hugh and talk about this important topic.
Yeah, well, thank you. Now, both of you, along with Dr. Mark Clark, who we'll meet later in the series, have written a book entitled Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, A Rational Christian Look at UFOs and Extraterrestrials, and this is published by NAV Press. In fact, our viewers may want to get a hold of that book if they want to find out more information about what you call the RUFO hypothesis. Now, UFOs are a common feature in our popular culture, Hugh. The question is how much of what we see in the movies and on television is actually true? Now, some people have a very sincere belief that there are UFOs, and not only that, but there are aliens trying to contact us. But it's your view that many of the sightings, if not most of them, can actually be explained by natural causes. What are some of the examples of natural causes that might explain UFO sightings, Hugh?
Well, I've been dealing with UFO sightings and reports since I was 15 years of age, and yes, the vast majority you can come up with either a natural explanation or some human-based explanation. Probably 95 to 99% of what people report as UFOs are really IFOs, identifiable flying objects. In terms of natural indications, probably the two most common would be fireballs and the planet Venus. Now, a fireball is a meteor. It's a meteor that comes relatively close to the observer. And, you know, when I was doing amateur astronomy, I would see several of these per year. In fact, the biggest one I saw was 4 times the diameter of the moon. So they can be quite dramatic.
So almost like a falling star, but more dramatic.
Yeah, it's a meteor, but it's one that comes close to the observer. They can be moving slowly relative to the observer. They can take zigzag paths. They can leave a smoke trail. There can be sounds.
What about swamp gas? Wasn't this something that explains a lot of things, or is that?
Well, swamp gas was something that was a popular explanation in the days of the Blue Book Project, and that's probably a very small percentage of the identifiable flying objects. Venus is a big one, and what you're dealing with there is Venus is a bright morning star. It's like 5 to 10 times brighter than it is when it's an evening star. So if you happen to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and Venus is at its closest approach to Earth, it's so bright you can read a newspaper by it. But people are stunned by the sight and will report it as a UFO.
Well, in addition to the natural explanations, there are some hoaxes, too, that explain
Sure.
UFO sightings. Is that right?
Well, I mean, you've got things like military aircraft, especially experimental military aircraft that the military doesn't want to be made public. I ran into a couple of those, and I was a professional astronomer, these crafts hovering over our telescope. And, you know, there was a lot of denials, but later on we found out that the military really did have these kinds of craft. In the area of hoaxes, always watch out for the undergraduate societies on university campuses. The undergraduate campus where I was trained, University of British Columbia, the engineering students loved to pull off pranks of people who report as UFOs. And you would deliberately set off, say, a bunch of hydrogen balloons and have them explode at a particular time in a particular formation, and they got great delight of the fact that thousands of people would report this as a UFO.
Okay, so Hugh, let me make sure I understand this. There are a large number of sightings, the largest percentage really, 95% or more, that can be explained by naturalistic causes. But there is a small percentage, but really representing a very large number of sightings, that simply cannot be explained by natural causes or by hoaxes or by hallucinations or by military aircraft or something else. And this is what you're calling the residual UFO.
That's correct. The truly unidentified flying object.
Now, Ken, we hear in the popular media a lot about UFO sightings and abductions. Is that what we're talking about here with our UFOs, the first, second, and third kind of contacts that we see in the movies?
Well, after you've eliminated these natural man-made UFOs and you have this residual experiences, they could be any number of things. They may be an aerial phenomena, something that someone sees in the sky. It could be some kind of encounter with an alleged alien being. It could be a contactee experience where there is this experience of communicating information to a particular individual. So when we talk about UFO phenomena, it's a broad range of possible experiences. Everything from something seen in the sky to a very intimate encounter.
Yeah, and a personal, intimate encounter, this would be like the third kind contact?
That's right. It could be, people claim abduction experiences where they're taken against their will. There are other people who have a religious experience and allegedly produce religious material. So there's a broad range of experiences.
You know, a lot of viewers, though, have the idea that anybody who claims to be abducted by an alien is a crackpot or crazy. Now, Hugh, you're a scientist. You think that there is a significant number, smaller percentage, but significant number that we have to take seriously. What is the hard physical evidence that compels you to take this seriously?
Well, of the 100,000 unidentifiable flying objects, the residual UFOs, only a tiny percentage would be the contactee or the abduction situation. Typically what you're dealing with is something that is clearly non-physical in nature, but it has physical effects. And I can give you some examples where people have an encounter with a UFO just a few feet away, and the thing is hovering, but there's no wind. There is no movement back and forth. There's no airflow. And so the observer is recognizing this isn't normal physics. Other places where there's a landing or a crash, but there's no debris left behind from the UFO. On the other hand, the grass will be burnt, or there'll be charring, compression of the soil. So there are physical effects coming from this apparently non-physical phenomena.
So one of your pieces of hard evidence from your perspective in this our UFO area is the physical effects that are left behind that you can't ignore.
Physical effects, but they're not the kinds of physical effects you would see from physical objects.
So there's something else going on here that needs to be explored.
Something else going on. I mean, here you're talking about a flying object that is moving at, say, 15,000 miles per hour. It's making sharp right-angle turns. Nothing physical can survive those accelerations and deaccelerations. There's no sonic booms. When they crash, there's no debris. On the other hand, there are substantial physical effects. No one has ever detected electromagnetic radiation from a UFO, but they do disturb electrical devices, disable automobile ignitions. disable radios. So there are physical effects coming from a non-physical cause.
Now, what about the reliability, though, of these eyewitness accounts that are conveying this information that you're describing right now?
Well, in these 100,000 RUFOs that scientists deal with, it's limited to just those that have multiple independent witnesses. So there's not, in other words, if a sighting is made by just one witness, then it's not put into the database. There's got to be at least two witnesses. They have to be independent. And then the credibility of the witnesses are checked into. Are these people recently released from a mental institution, or have they been an airline pilot for 30 years?
But a lot of these people are professional astronomers and pilots and stuff like that, so they're in a position to make these observations. You trust their credibility, generally speaking, and so it isn't that their credibility as witnesses is undermined, and this is, again, is another point that causes you to take these seriously.
Well, when you interview the witness, you look for things like, do they have delusions of grandeur? Are they looking for publicity? Are they looking for status? And there are many reports where it's just the opposite. The witness really doesn't want any public exposure, and doesn't have these psychological problems, would rather not be given a lot of attention. And yet they have all this experience and education which would make them a credible witness. They're able to report exactly where in the sky this took place. They can do triangulation to see what's going on. So, in that context, it's not just unreliable witnesses.
So, Ken, you're actually coming, though, from a position of, in a sense, the educated skeptic, but you have to be fair with the real solid evidence that you're facing right now in this RUFO contingent here, aren't you?
That's right. Even though the phenomena as a whole, the popular phenomena, is surrounded by wild claims, once you begin to tear down into this phenomena, you discover that there are credible people. Hugh mentioned pilots, people who don't seem to be out there to gain anything, and they describe these experiences. And it's not just physical experiences. Sometimes it's also experiences that they've had. It affects them deeply as people. And not all of this can be just, put away and said, well, it's just a psychological phenomenon.
Well, for example, Greg, it even affects dogs and cattle. I mean, if you're going to attribute it to some psychological disturbance, it's not just human beings. Often someone's pet dog is the first to notice the UFO. And they start barking at the UFO, then the owner gets up and takes a look and has this. So if you're going to attribute it to just some psychologically unbalanced people, then you've got to explain how come all these cows and dogs
psychologically unbalanced animals in the mix as well. Well, you've mentioned about credible witnesses. What about other people in the field? Are there people who are professionals like yourself that are taking these things seriously, Hugh?
Yeah. There are many physicists and astronomers that have devoted serious studies to the UFO phenomenon. Perhaps the most famous would be Alan Hynek and Jacques Vallée. Jacques Vallée has put in more than 30 years of study. Both of these are physicists and astronomers. Peter Sturrock is the gentleman at Stanford University that launched this journal, the Journal of Scientific Exploration. It's a publication of the Society for Scientific Exploration.
And this is a peer-reviewed journal?
It's a peer-reviewed journal, and Peter conducted a survey of astronomers in America and their experiences with UFOs. Richard Haynes, who's also up in the San Francisco Bay Area, is a psychologist, PhD psychologist, who's worked with Peter on checking out reports from credible observers like pilots. And there's literally over a dozen physicists and research scientists who put significant study into this.
Well, Ken, apparently we have enough factual evidence to get the skilled and serious professionals involved in the question here. Now, what kind of theories have they come up with to explain the RUFOs?
Well, Greg, there are three broad general theories that try to explain UFOs. One of them is a simple explanation. I don't think it fits the facts. And that is that all UFOs are explained naturally. They're just misidentified natural phenomena. There really is, in their minds, no external stimulus to this. It's misidentified natural phenomena, misidentified human phenomena, delusions, hoaxes.
So it's all natural in their view.
That's right.
We don't have to go outside of the natural realm to explain
Popular
this.
explanation in that category is that we don't understand Earth lights. There's some unexplained or misunderstood
Yes.
physical phenomena that's termed Earth lights, and if we can just get into that a little more, that'll clear up the whole residual UFO problem.
Right.
So it's a thoroughgoing naturalistic explanation.
Yes.
Okay. What's another one?
The second one is a very sensationalist view. It is called the extraterrestrial hypothesis, that there are physical beings from maybe another part of the universe, another galaxy, and they're sending physical crafts to the Earth. This is sometimes referred as the nuts and bolts theory. And these alien beings, these extraterrestrial beings, are encountering humanity. They may be giving messages. They may be trying to save humanity. But this is a theory that is often held by people here in the United States, that these are physical crafts, physical beings from another part of the universe, another galaxy.
A la Carl Sagan in the movie Contact, for example.
Right.
Yes, and often even in more popular terms, little green men who are physical.
The LGMs that the astronomers refer to. But there's a third theory, because as you pointed out so far and hinted at, and we'll cover more in subsequent sessions, these UFOs can't be explained entirely by those explanations, and so there's been a third theory that professionals have suggested.
That's right. The extraterrestrial theory has its problems, serious problems. There's another view, what I call an interdimensional view, that this is a real phenomena, but it's not physical. It may be from another dimension. And this is much more in keeping with where we believe the facts point to, a non-physical reality, but it has certain spiritual elements connected to it, or religious elements that are connected.
In a sense that it transcends our physical realm. It's not the same as Jacques Vallée's or one of Jacques Vallée's appeals to interdimensionality, in that he talks about the 10 dimensions of the universe, the 6 tiny ones that complement the 4. That's not what we're talking about here. Or this idea that something in between the dimensions that's somehow connected with the 10 space-time dimensions. We're really talking an extra-dimensional explanation from beyond matter, energy, and the 10 space-time dimensions.
Then this goes back, Hugh, to your point that the evidence shows that there are certainly physical things that are happening, but they're happening in ways that are inconsistent with the laws of physics.
Right.
And so, if not natural, maybe supranatural in some fashion, and this comprises maybe the third possible explanation for the RUFOs.
Yeah, and these are broad categories. What we're
Yes.
going to try to do is look at each of these 3 broad categories, but also dig in and see, well, can we get more specific than just...
Now, Hugh, in upcoming episodes, we'll be examining each of these 3 theories, but I want to pause for a moment and briefly examine theory number 1. I mean, it sounds reasonable to me that while these RUFOs may not be explained today, that maybe sometime in the future, relying on the things that we have at our disposal right now, we'll be able to find some natural explanation. That seems to be the most economical, the simplest way of approaching this problem. What's wrong with that approach?
Because there's overwhelming evidence that these UFOs are non-physical in nature. The fact that they violate the laws of physics. We just described how they're hovering, but without any apparent gravity going on. There's no force, no wind. Sometimes they'll knock out a swath of buildings, but again, there's no wind, there's no physical force associated with the effects that are observed. The fact that they can make right-angle turns at 18,000 miles an hour. The fact that they change shape and color at will. They will split apart and reintegrate. Physical objects can't do that. Finite beams of light, or a beam of light will come out Star Wars fashion and just stop. There's no debris at the crash sites from the UFOs.
So simply put, you reject the first theory that there are natural explanations that might be found for these phenomena simply because everything we know about this RUFO segment here violates natural law, and there's no good reason to believe that our views of natural law.
For some of them. I'm not saying that, obviously most UFOs have a physical explanation.
Right.
Those would be the identifiable flying objects. But these residual UFOs, there's just way too much evidence that they have non-physical properties. They violate the laws of physics. all over the place. So, in that perspective, a strictly naturalistic explanation like Earth lights, well, if Earth lights are physical, then why do they violate the laws of physics?
Right. Okay.
Greg, I think as well, when you look at that idea of everything can be explained naturally, we don't live in the future. We live in the here and the now. We have to explain this phenomenon the best way that we can. We don't want to presuppose that everything has a natural explanation without some real good evidence to support that.
Okay. Well, let's just summarize what we've discussed so far in our first segment. What we've determined is that while the vast majority of UFOs have a naturalistic explanation, you believe that there's a small percentage, maybe 1 to 5%, which is really a large number, as it turns out, of credible UFO encounters that don't have a natural explanation. And we're calling these residual UFOs, or RUFOs.
Yeah, physical effects, but coming from a non-physical cause.
Okay. So you believe the RUFOs are not only real, but there's evidence to believe they're not actually completely physical because they exhibit these behaviors that violate the laws of physics.
And hence this explains why people are so disturbed by UFOs, because there's a strong philosophical bias in much of modern society which says there is no such thing as non-physical reality. And so all of this evidence is simply rejected. But in the case of UFOs, I think we really do have hard evidence for non-physical reality, and there's hard evidence for that in other disciplines of science. Astrophysics gives us hard evidence of non-physical reality. So I think we can use that to help people get over their natural bias against such explanations.
Well, in the next segment, I want to ask our panel of experts, what are the chances of finding life in outer space? Or are we alone in the universe? Thank you both for joining us, and thank you. See you next time.
While about 95% of all unidentified flying objects are reclassified as identified flying objects, there still remains a 5% residual of sightings that defy conventional explanation. Of the theories to explain residual UFOs, the most popular theory is called the extraterrestrial, or ET, hypothesis. Are humans really alone in the universe? Do these residual UFOs carry visitors from other worlds? Can we really know if intelligent life exists elsewhere in the universe? Stay with us as we visit extraterrestrials as the basis for the RUFO hypothesis.
Welcome once again to this special edition of Reasons to Believe. Now, we've been discussing the RUFO hypothesis. Our panel of experts have been developing a theory that best fits the facts surrounding UFOs and also offers a unique approach to this very difficult problem. I'm your host, Greg Kokel, and I'm joined today by astronomer and minister and UFO researcher, Dr. Hugh Ross. Welcome back, Dr. Ross.
Thank you.
And joining Dr. Ross is cult researcher, Christian theologian, and philosopher, Mr. Kenneth Samples. Ken, welcome back.
Hello, Greg.
Now, both of you are co-authors with Dr. Mark Clark of the book Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, a Rational Christian Look at UFOs and Extraterrestrials. It's published by Nav Press, and some of our viewers might want to get a hold of that book if they want more information about what we're discussing here today. Now, gentlemen, we began last time discussing the idea that the vast majority of UFO sightings have explanations, natural explanations, aircraft, planet Venus, that kind of thing. But there still remains a number, 1 to 5% of the sightings, which actually is a fairly large number, as you characterized it, Dr. Ross, that don't have an explanation yet. These are the RUFOs, or residual UFOs, that we talked about. Now, we briefly began to look at 3 possible explanations for those residual UFOs, and we talked about theory number 1, which is naturalistic explanations, and we realized that there are some good reasons not to lump all those residuals as having naturalistic causes that we don't know anything about yet. Right. That's really hoping in the future, and that's not a safe way to go scientifically. It doesn't comport with the evidence as you've described it. I want to look now at theory number 2. This is the extraterrestrial hypothesis, the ET hypothesis. This brings to mind Dr. Carl Sagan, a universe that's teeming with life. Now, Hugh, you're an astrophysicist. That's your field. Is it plausible that we live in a universe that is filled with life, as Dr. Sagan suggested?
I would say no for 2 reasons. One is the failure of a naturalistic explanation for the origin of life in any environment in the universe, even in its simplest form. And number 2, the anthropic principle. And you mentioned Carl Sagan. He's the one that first popularized the idea that our solar system must be fine-tuned, that certain characteristics must be narrowly defined for physical life to be possible on our planet. Then Robert Dicke from Princeton University, a physicist there, was the one who first introduced the idea that the universe, likewise, must have narrowly defined characteristics for physical life to be possible. And Carl never really kept up to date with the advance of these narrowly defined characteristics. Now, he was the one that made the point that you have to have a certain kind of star for life to be possible. And the planet that has life on it must be a certain distance from that star for life to be possible.
This would be an example of one of those fine-tuned factors that you're talking about, right?
So that gives you 2 fine-tuned characteristics, and based on those 2, he says, well, given that there's so many stars and planets in the observable universe, that would add up to thousands or maybe even tens of thousands of possible life sites in our universe, even in our galaxy. But the problem is that we know of many more than just 2 characteristics of the solar system that must be narrowly defined to make any kind of physical life possible. In fact, what you'll find in the book that we've co-authored is that there are 147 different characteristics that must be narrowly defined for a planet to be capable of supporting life. For example, the galaxy's got to be just right. Not any old galaxy will do. You need a middle-aged, medium-large size galaxy that's spiral in structure, sustaining star formation for billions of years, far away from any large cluster of galaxies.
Now, so if I understand you right, what you're doing is when you look at all of these galaxies that are theoretically candidates for life,
right,
these factors eliminate a bunch of them from the get-go.
99.9% of all galaxies are eliminated right at the get-go.
And that's just with one characteristic you're talking about.
Those are 3 characteristics of a galaxy that must be fine-tuned for physical life to be possible.
What are some of the others?
Well, then you start to examine, well, okay, if you have this just right galaxy, which stars in that just right galaxy would be candidates to have planets like Earth? And you discover that the characteristics of the star must be very narrowly fine-tuned. That must be a star of almost identical the mass of our star, the Sun, of the same age as our star, the Sun, the same spectral characteristics of our Sun. It must be a star that's orbiting what's called the co-rotation distance from the center of our galaxy. In other words, it can't be too far from the center of the galaxy. It can't be too close from the center of the galaxy. It must be a star that stays in the plane of the galaxy. It's not allowed to bounce up and down in the plane. And so the bottom line is you're eliminating the vast majority of stars in that just right galaxy. It's much more narrowly defined than the galaxy. Then, of course, there's the planet. The planet must be fine-tuned, and it must have the right planetary companions. Jupiter and Saturn play a critical role in whether or not our planet can sustain life. If they're too big, they'll disturb the orbit of the planet. If they're too small, then Earth would get hit by too many comets and asteroids.
Because the gravitational field of the others protect the Earth in a sense.
Right. And the moon is critical. You have to have just the right moon orbiting this just right Earth. The moon plays a critical role in stabilizing our rotation axis so it doesn't flip back and forth like we see with the other planets in the galaxy.
Hugh, give us a number. What are the chances that all of these parameters can come together at just the right time in just the right planet to sustain complex life?
Well, Greg, there's about 147 different characteristics minimum that must be fine-tuned in order for physical life, not just life as we know it, but any kind of physical life to be possible on a planet, or even take an exotic site like a moon or a divorced planet. And the probability that all 147 characteristics would be met is less than 1 chance in 10 to the 186. Now, the Carl Sagans of the world will say, well, doesn't the universe have a lot of planets? Well, it does, but astronomers over the past 2 years have been able to establish a rather hard limit on the maximum number of planets in the observable universe. For example, we know that only 2% of the stars in our galaxy can sustain planets, could possibly have planets going around them. And so what that means is that the maximum number of planets that could exist in our universe is 10 to the 22. You take the 22, subtract from the 186, that leaves you with 1 chance in 10 to the 164 that you'll find one planet anywhere else in the universe with a capacity to support any kind of conceivable life. Only 1 chance in 10 to the 164.
Now, you gave us a large number, 1, 10 to the 188th, plus your other calculation. I mean, give us a sense. That's great for astronomers. For us plain folk, give us a sense of how big those numbers are or how small that chance actually turns out to be.
1 chance in 10 to the 164. So 164 zeros after the 1. We need to realize that the universe itself contains fewer than 10 to the 79 protons and neutrons total.
You mean all the elementary particles, you add everything up?
Yeah, just the protons and neutrons.
In the whole
entire
universe.
Physical universe, it's only 10 to the 79. Or to put it another way, the probability of you being killed in the next few seconds by sudden reversal of the second law of thermodynamics is about 1 chance in 10 to the 80th. But we all realize that's such a tiny possibility that you're justified in not worrying about being killed by that sudden reversal. It's just never going to happen.
In layman's terms, there's just no possibility then
the probability is indistinguishable from zero.
From zero.
There is no possibility.
So you're given the possibility or the theory that maybe ETs are involved in these things. Is the first problem you mentioned is, well, you got a probability problem of life happening by accident anywhere in the universe, just in terms of the origin of life issue. That was the first point you made. And the second point you made was...
Incidentally, that probability is also indistinguishable from zero.
So complicating that, the possibility that the conditions of life, for life rather, will be good anywhere else in the universe are also zero. This planet is a unique situation. So the bottom line is we could very well be alone in the universe. And in fact, that conclusion, if I understand it right, and Ken, I'd like to get your feedback on this, seems to be a growing consensus among professionals in the field.
That's right. And I think what's interesting about this, Greg, is that the extraterrestrial hypothesis assumes a naturalistic explanation of things, that life had some kind of natural origin, and that it would happen frequently and all over the place. But as you've mentioned, there is a growing consensus that this emerging anthropic principle is well supported in various disciplines.
It's not just coming from Christian research scientists. I mean, I wrote a book on this, The Crater in the Cosmos, where I discussed this anthropic principle and how hopeless the odds are of finding a home like Earth to support life anywhere else in the universe. But I'm not alone. Stuart Ross Taylor, this book, Destiny or Chance, drew the same conclusion. Dean Overman, A Case Against Accident and Self-Organization. And this book, written by a couple of University of Washington, well, it was an astronomer and a paleontologist, both coming from a non-Christian perspective, Rare Earth, drew the same conclusion. So regardless of the theological perspective of the astronomer or the physicist, they would agree with Paul Davies' assessment, an agnostic astronomer, that the evidence for design that's necessary for the support of life is utterly overwhelming.
But Hugh, let's just say for the sake of argument, there is this planet somewhere in the far reaches of the universe that managed to have life on it, survived, it's technologically advanced. Could these ETs be the explanation for the RUFOs that have yet to be explained?
No. I can think of 3 reasons. You got the distance problem, you have the velocity problem, and then you got the number problem. There's just way too many of these things.
Okay.
And in terms of distance, we're looking at hundreds of light years that these craft would have to travel. In the sense that we've already, as astronomers, been able to look at star systems that are close to planet Earth and recognize, based on the anthropic principle, they're non-candidates. Life can't exist there, so it's got to be beyond 155 light years from which these aliens would have to travel to. So that's a long ways through space. For example, take the fastest NASA spacecraft. We're looking at 112,000 years for that craft to travel that minimum distance of space.
But Hugh, this is just a technological problem. I mean, the world was large to people 50 years ago. Now the world's small. You can get around it in a day. Maybe 50 or 100 years from now, we'll have the technology to overcome these kind of problems in space travel, and therefore the ETs might have overcome it as well.
Well, the problem with transporting physical beings over interstellar space is you have to keep them alive, which means you must protect them from the cosmic radiation that exists in outer space, and you must protect them from the debris, the meteorites, the gas, and the dust that's out there. And the problem is the faster you go, what you want to do, you want to cut down that 112,000 years to something that's more manageable. But the faster you go, the greater the damage to your craft and the greater the damage to the beings on board. And it goes up with a square of the velocity. So if you double the velocity, the damage goes up 4 times. If you triple the velocity, it goes up 9 times. And so realistically, and this is something I deal with in the book, there's no way a spacecraft housing physical beings on board could travel at greater than 1/10 the velocity of light. Well, if we're talking traversing, say, 200 light years, that means 2,000 years for a one-way trip. So this has already put you beyond one lifespan to make the trip. And moreover, there's no guarantee that you would get those people there and back alive. Even getting to Mars is technologically difficult in terms of the hazards of interplanetary space.
Plus, what you're saying is a lot of people think of space as being space, empty, but it's not empty.
It's not empty.
Filled with dangerous things.
It's filled with dangerous things, and the faster you go, the greater the damage you're going to take, which means that your spaceship is going to have thick armor plate on it in order to withstand the meteoritic impacts. And you're going to need something like lead to protect the inhabitants from radiation. And the faster you go, the more of this stuff you need. And then suddenly you got the problem of moving this through interstellar space. You're going to need a lot more energy, hence a lot more fuel to move this through space.
And when you have more fuel, you have more weight, and you have larger size, and it complicates the other problems.
You need more fuel to move the fuel. So,
yeah.
The bottom line is, if you're talking a 200 light year trip, you're not going to make it with physical beings. No matter how much technology you have, no matter how much money you have, you're going beyond the limits of the laws of physics and the characteristics of the universe.
Now, Ken, Dr. Ross said there are 3 problems: the distance problem, the velocity problem, and then the numbers problem. How's the numbers problem work in here?
Yeah, you see the tremendous odds of even one craft traversing that kind of distance, but according to UFO phenomena, there are tens of thousands, possibly millions of crafts, and they're all slightly different from one another.
And they're all small.
They're all very small.
And they're small, they're not going to make it.
So how do we, that raises even another question, what kind of economic issues are we dealing with that a civilization, a so-called civilization, could send that many crafts? There are multiple problems with this kind of interpretation.
Yeah, one physicist calculated that another planet would have to send out 10,000 spaceships per year to account for even the minimum number of residual UFOs.
And part of what you're talking about economics is there's got to be a factory somewhere that's building these things, and how do you maintain that? And these are some of the practical problems a lot of people don't ever consider.
If they're intelligent, they're going to use the assembly line process. They're not going to make different handmade craft every time they do it.
That's right.
And is there something like standard vehicles that you see with the same characteristics, or is there a duplicity, or rather, is there a large variety of different?
An argument can be made that virtually every UFO that is perceived or observed is different from the next one. And that raises serious problems.
So, Hugh, not only are you skeptical about the possibility that complex life exists anywhere in the universe for the reasons you gave, the problems of life starting by accident anywhere, and also the problem of the anthropic principle that everything's got to be just fine-tuned in the environment for that life to continue to exist. But even if it did, you're skeptical that E.T. Could overcome the physical barriers that are obvious for any kind of extended space travel that could that would be necessary.
Well, something that NASA's even discovered: the farther away you go, the more economical it is to send machines rather than human beings. And if these extraterrestrials are intelligent, they're going to be able to figure that out. That you're much better off sending machines. I mean, you can send millions of machines for the price of sending just one. Spaceship.
Right.
And they're going to know that, and literally it goes up with a square. So if you're talking something beyond nearby planets, you're not going to send beings.
Well, Hugh, there are a lot of experts that agree with you here that there is a distance problem, although some have some unique solutions to that problem. In fact, we're going to read some excerpts from an interview with theoretical physicist Dr. Michio Kaku, from an interview on the abcnews.com website. Now, Dr. Kaku has written some books about the science of space travel, and he agrees with Dr. Ross that E.T. will have to abide by the same laws of physics that we do. In fact, here's what he says. Alien intelligence will have to conform to the laws of physics as we know them. However, there are loopholes in the laws of physics that have to be investigated. Now, this loophole that Dr. Kaku suggests is more widely known as a wormhole. He says, quote, "This wormhole allows you to leap across vast distances within the twinkling of an eye without violating Einstein's theory of general relativity. However, the quantum theory, we still don't know whether or not the wormhole is stable once we take into account radiation effects. We don't know what lies on the other side of the wormhole. However, the theory, the mathematics, the computer programs, all seem to indicate that if you could harness what is called the Planck energy, 10 to the 19 billion electron volts, then you could open up a hole in space and time. You become masters of space and time." Close quote. Hugh, you're the astrophysicist. What do you think of this explanation? Can wormholes provide the solution to the distance problem?
No, there are three fundamental problems, but maybe I need to first describe what a wormhole is. It's a black hole singularity attached to another black hole singularity. So think of a highly massive compact object that forms this highly curved space-time configuration.
Kind of a funnel almost.
A funnel, right. And if one tip of that funnel from one black hole joins with the tip of the funnel from a second black hole, then you've got this wormhole where you can take a shortcut through space and time. But one of the problems is the idea that you can get the two funnels of two different black holes connecting one another to form a wormhole. That's highly improbable under the physics that we understand. The probability of getting two of these black hole singularities connecting is extremely improbable. The second problem is even if they were to join together like that, it's highly unstable. The probability of them suddenly breaking apart is extremely high. It's only going to be there for the tiniest fraction of a second before it falls apart. So that means you've got to get through the black hole fast. But the most problematic problem of all is that nothing physical can travel through the wormhole. I mean, as Kaku points out, this is something that happens at the quantum level. And just for example, if we were to take your body and push it in through a wormhole, you're approaching this black hole, and the first thing you notice is that your body, 6 feet tall, gets stretched out to about 3 miles long, where all of the atoms in your body get strung out in a long line. And then as you approach the singularity, even the particles break down, so none of the particles would survive. And then even the smallest particle is not capable of traveling through the wormhole. So mathematically, wormholes are possible. Are wormholes possible? Yes, the mathematics of general relativity and quantum mechanics allows that possibility. The problem is the dimension of the wormhole is so incredibly tiny, not even the smallest quantum physical entity can travel down and through the wormhole.
So given our first two possibilities, that there's some unknown natural explanation or that this is ETs coming from another place, it seems like, Ken, given our first two explanations, which turn out to be natural explanations, either natural causes we don't know about or real natural ETs that are in some other part of the universe, it seems like physics has just slammed the door on those two possibilities.
Yeah, it seems interesting that once you begin to critique a naturalistic interpretation of life, you also have to add those criticisms to the extraterrestrial hypothesis. The extraterrestrial hypothesis depends upon a naturalistic understanding of life in the universe.
So as I understand it, Ken, the same body of evidence weighs against both hypotheses equally, so we have to really give some thought to the third hypothesis.
That's right, Greg.
So to sum up our point here, gentlemen, if these UFOs are physical, then their ability to get here seems virtually impossible. In fact, given the mountain of parameters that you've just described here that are needed in order to have just one single planet in the universe capable of sustaining life anywhere is almost miraculous, if I could use that word here. But we do seem to have credible evidence still that something's going on. We still have our UFOs, that they exist, and that means if the first two explanations don't work, then maybe we have to look more closely at the third explanation. And this explanation has to somehow account for all of the data. The fact that these UFOs are real, but they don't exhibit physical properties, but actually exhibit some of the non-physical properties that you discussed last time.
Non-physical cause with physical effects.
Right.
Non-physical reality.
Well, coming up in our next segment, we'll be joined by Dr. Mark Clark. He's an expert in military defense, and he'll be addressing the question, what does the United States government know about UFOs? Is there a cover-up? What are they hiding in Area 51? Thank you for joining us. See you next time.
In July of 1947, something strange crashed into the desert near Roswell, New Mexico. First witnesses on the scene found aluminum-type material and wood with strange markings on it. Speculations soared that this crash involved an actual alien spacecraft. Only after the end of the Cold War did military sources reveal what had actually crashed. It was a top-secret weather balloon designed to acoustically detect Soviet nuclear test detonations. Yet rumors and speculations about alien contact persist to this day. While the events of Roswell can be explained, the question still remains: is the government covering up evidence of alien visitation? Or could these UFO sightings be naturally explained away as secret military activity? In this episode, we consider whether or not the government can provide a solution to the UFO hypothesis.
Welcome once again to this special edition of Reasons to Believe. And we've been discussing the RUFO hypothesis, and our panel of experts have been developing a theory that fits the facts surrounding UFOs and offers a unique approach to this difficult problem. I'm your host, Greg Kokel. I'm joined once again by astronomer, minister, and UFO investigator, Dr. Hugh Ross.
Good to be here.
Good to have you back again. And I also want to welcome Professor of Political Science and Director of a National Security Studies program, Dr. Mark Clark. Dr. Clark, good to have you here.
Thank you, Greg.
Now, Dr. Clark, you're author, along with Dr. Ross and Ken Samples, who was here in our last session, of a book entitled Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, A Rational Christian Look at UFOs and Extraterrestrials. Now, this is published by NAV Press. And by the way, if our viewers want to read more about what we're calling the RUFO hypothesis in more detail, you want to get a hold of this book that you gentlemen have written. Now, we began our series discussing your theory that the vast majority of UFO sightings have very natural explanations.
That's right.
Misidentified man-made phenomenon, hoaxes. And you also believe, however, even though some can be explained by those means, there is still this 1 to 5%, which really is a large number, as it turns out, that we're calling those leftover UFO sightings, or RUFOs, residual UFOs.
That's right, Greg.
Now, in the last episode, we began considering the extraterrestrial hypothesis. This is the idea that we live in a universe which is just teeming with life. Unfortunately, this theory has run into some serious problems because the statistical improbability, first of all, of finding another planet anywhere in the universe capable of sustaining complex life forms is virtually nil. We've also considered some of the physical problems, even if life did exist somewhere else, making it virtually impossible for long-distance space travel. Now, a second aspect of the extraterrestrial hypothesis has to do with what does the government know about UFOs, and this is why we brought you in, Dr. Clark, because this is your specialty. When the popular media talks about government cover-ups of UFOs, there are three topics that come up, three things that are mentioned: Roswell, Project Blue Book, and Area 51.
And of those three, the two that have gotten the most play nowadays are Roswell and Area 51, for reasons we'll talk about.
Yeah, and we'll get to those in a few minutes because they're very important. We heard, Mark, in the introductory segment of this session, your theory of what happened at Roswell. And this was New Mexico, 1947. A lot of people know about this particular incident. Do you think that most UFO sightings have natural explanations like the one you offered there, in this case military aircraft that was classified?
I'm not sure the most, but I would say a substantial portion of them are military research aircraft, for reasons we'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, I think there's a substantial fraction of them are military aircraft that are misidentified as UFO phenomena for reasons we'll talk about. But it's really fascinating. There's a recent report out now that talks about triangular-shaped aircraft being spotted, and they're always in corridors in which you have military installations from one point to another. And so that's the more kind of ubiquitous phenomenon.
And this, the stealth bomber has that shape, that triangular shape, and this is the kind of thing that a lot of people are seeing right now.
Precisely. That and the F-117, the fighter, stealth fighter that was used in the Gulf War so effectively, also has that shape, though a little bit different, and we can discuss that further.
Okay. Give me a recap very quickly for our viewers of your view of what actually happened in Roswell.
Well, about June 24th, 10 days before that, June 14th, 1947, something landed, or something crashed, near Roswell, New Mexico. About 10 days later, you had Pilot Arnold up by Washington giving the first modern sighting of UFO phenomena. A guy by the name of Mac Brazel, whose ranch is near this area, happened to discover this material. Didn't think much of it, but went back after the reported sightings by Pilot Arnold. Went back on about July 3rd or July 4th, found this material, and brought it out, the material that we discussed in the opening segment. Major Jesse Marcel was the base intelligence officer at Roswell, and he and a couple of others reported in the media that they found a crashed saucer. Well, it came on the heels of Pilot Arnold's report.
Right.
And so they interpreted the tape markings that were on there. And this is Scotch tape that was discovered in New York, a New York toy company, calling it hieroglyphics. They didn't have a context or a notion of what was really going on. And the reason for that is that there was weather balloon experiments being conducted, but there was a secret component to that whole event. And this was reported by a fellow by the name of Dr. Charles Moore, who happened to be on that project. But he didn't report this until 1996. He did not even know the name of the project. It was later called Project Mogul. And what it was designed to do was to be able to detect Soviet nuclear detonations acoustically by being on these lofted weather balloons high in the atmosphere and be able to detect them. We were looking for ways to detect what the Soviets were doing. And so all this comes out much later. But the initial event was just about 5 pounds of material, leftover material, very small things.
But as I understand it from your writings and the book that you have co-authored with Ken Samples and Dr. Ross, that all of the particular physical evidence can be traced back to domestic sources, like the tape going back to New York. It's just tape that was used to fasten some things onto the balloon, and it had these little figures on. Like,
and it had aluminum foil reflectors so that they could detect it with radar, so they could track where the balloon was going, and balsa wood, because they wanted it light to be able to loft up.
Well, you know, why is the U.S. government so secretive about these issues, Dr. Clark? I mean, sometimes it seems that these UFO trends are supported by these sightings that could easily be explained if the government would just come public and tell people, that's us, not them, that's up there.
Well, there's a couple of things. There really is a conspiracy, and I'm going to put it in those stark terms. There is a conspiracy by the government, and the conspiracy is to deny information to our enemies, particularly the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but even to, say, China today, and other countries that have adverse interest with respect to us. So in a sense, there's a conspiracy, and the conspiracy is to keep silent on a lot of our research and development.
Which is the same conspiracy virtually every government has in terms of its national security.
Absolutely, and it's obliged to, by law, to defend the interests of the United States. So they're obliged to find ways to do it. Why we have this system of classification is because, well, for example, let me take a step back. Anything to deal with intelligence issues, that is the collection of information from another country, is one type of clearance, and that's called SCI, or Special Compartmented Intelligence. The other kind of information, that is on nuclear weapons, say, that we do not want the enemy to know, we're protecting our secrets and not trying to exploit others, is called ESI, Extremely Sensitive Information. So if you go into government, you're required to take either one of or the other. Very few people get actually both of those clearance systems. And you're obliged, once you take this, you're taking an oath to protect these secrets for as many years as the government says they need to be classified. And so for a number of reasons, the government does not want to, it can't explain it.
For security reasons, their hands are just strapped, is basically what you're saying. And though they could clear up some of this confusion or speculation, there's a greater good to be accomplished with security.
Sure.
And this is why they're being careful about that.
And there are some who say that we keep too many secrets. And that can be debated. I don't doubt that that's a problem. A number of these issues are probably not nearly as secret as they need to be kept. But when you talk about high-tech military stuff, we're trying to deny spies from finding out what we're researching and what we're doing. And for example, in the 80s, there was a great tactic by Soviets, and the Soviet people that supposedly worked in their aircraft industry were coming over for just normal tours of Lockheed Martin, Boeing. But what was discovered was that planted among them, there were certain KGB agents. And what they were doing were actually GRU, military intelligence. And what they were doing is they had sticky soles to their shoes, and they would pick up the materials that were shavings from the material that we're developing all throughout the 70s and 80s.
So security is a very important consideration here, and this is why the government hasn't, maybe appearing to have a conspiracy to cover up UFOs, and they're just really have a conspiracy to protect their interests in terms of defense and the like.
Sure,
so national security. But what about Project Blue Book? Wasn't this an attempt by the government to try to track some of these UFO things and explain them?
Well, actually,
and some would say maybe explain them away.
Sure. Well, that's the biggest charge against Project Blue Book. That some of the people on it said that, or around it said that this was a way, a rationalization to explain away UFO phenomena. But what in fact happened? There was two projects that occurred earlier: Project Sign and Project Grudge. And both of those were attempts early on to find out and discover whether there was actually not so much UFOs, but whether the Soviets were conducting high technology experimental aircraft. And so what they were looking for, you imagine this is the Air Force. It was born in 1947. We had the Army Air Corps before it. It's a new institution, new branch of the military.
They're trying to justify themselves and
they have to
show themselves to be important.
And they do, but not initially. And so what they're doing is they're looking at to determine whether this is a real phenomenon, it's real by the Soviets, and it's a threat to the U.S. In Project Sign and again in Project Grudge, both times they deduced and concluded that it was neither a real threat or a real concern. Now, what happened with Project Blue Book is typical of any bureaucracy that gets started on something, they get stuck with it. And the Air Force, because they're responsible for aerospace, was stuck with this all along, and they reluctantly were forced to take on Project Blue Book, which began in the early 50s. And Project Blue Book became for them, the bigger concern early, if you remember, was the McCarthy era, okay? Right. There was a great heightened concern about Soviet behavior, communist behavior. Right. And in Project Blue Book, what they were more afraid of at that point, since they determined this was neither real nor a threat to U.S. interests, what they determined was that UFO sightings could clog communication channels, that the Soviets might use this hysteria as a way of clogging our communication channels to launch a surprise attack. And that's what the big concern was. So in many ways, the people that were tasked to Blue Book were, in fact, responsible for trying to explain away the sightings. Later in 1950...
To stem the hysteria to some degree, so
absolutely.
It could be capitalized on by the Soviets.
Exactly.
Okay.
That was their big concern initially. By 1955, another concern came up, and that was we had the development of the U-2 aircraft,
right,
which will tie in a little bit later to Area 51. It was developed out at that site. The U-2 aircraft was a high-flying reconnaissance, high-surveillance aircraft. As we know, in 1960, shot down over the Soviets, Gary Powers. Now, the first of these were silver in appearance. They weren't thinking too much about stealth at that time because nothing could shoot them down. They were so high. And they flew at between altitudes of between 50 and 60,000 feet. At the time, commercial aircraft only flew at 20 to 30,000 feet. So what you can imagine is you have this aircraft that's now flying higher than anything ever had before historically. And so people on the ground at dusk could look up and see something reflecting sunlight
or
at very
even
high altitudes.
At nighttime, because the sun going over the curvature of the Earth would be reflecting off of this craft. And so you've got this moving, flying, glowing craft in the middle of the night.
Very high altitude, very fast the first time they saw it.
Right.
And so we have to step back and think through. I mean, the first satellites, Sputnik and things, were novel to people. And this was classified because the main purpose, remember Eisenhower denied that we were doing spy flights over the Soviet Union up until 1960, up until Gary Powers was shot down. And that's why Khrushchev embarrassed him. Because he exposed them, said we had them, and put them on public display.
So, Dr. Clark, what you're saying is that Project Blue Book is a reluctant effort by the Air Force, which is really concerned with strategic issues and defense of the nation. They're not concerned about the UFO threat because they don't see them as a military problem, except as the Soviet Union is going to use the hysteria. So, strategically, they want to quell the hysteria and understate that issue. Plus, if I understand you correctly, they understood that most of these sightings that were unexplained were really their own aircraft. Right?
And that's the interesting part of this. The researchers talk about this later on in Project Blue Book. Fully 50% of the sightings in the mid-50s, mid to late 50s, were known U-2 flights.
Is that 50% of the Blue Book?
Yes, of the reported sightings that came in, fully 50% were known U-2 flights that they couldn't discuss. In fact, this explains a lot of the vague language that leads to conspiracy theories because they're trying to be ambiguous about what's going on, and they have to.
Yeah, I know one of the things that people have been very tight-lipped about, at least from official sources, is is Area 51.
Yes.
Does Area 51 actually exist, or is this just kind of X-Files hysteria?
Well, there is a place, I'm not sure the official name. If you talk about Area 51 or Groom Lake, it is a dry lake bed called Groom Lake in the area in which this site is, this military installation. To give you an example of how vague people can be when they have clearances, how they try to be ambiguous about and dodge that problem, I talked to a person that I know in the Senate Armed Services Committee several years ago about Area 51, and as soon as I mentioned it, they tap-danced around the whole subject and walked away from it. So I knew that it was a highly sensitive thing. One more example. I went to a conference at the Defense Intelligence Agency about 1997, and there was listed on top of one of the boards that we were at, and this was supposed to be an unclassified conference. And so none of us there or some had clearances, but a lot of us didn't. And there was this symbol, TK, that was there. And I went back and I asked some friends. They were in the government. I said, what does this stand for? And 2 or 3 of them just refused to talk about it until someone told me, well, that's been released. 6 months ago, that name was declassified. That stands for Talent Keyhole, and that refers to a particular satellite, the KH-11 that we have in outer space, that looks like the Hubble Space Telescope, except it's turned towards the Earth.
So there almost is a kind of, and one might say, appropriate paranoia about letting this information out, and so there's this cloud of secrecy that surrounds Area 51, but we actually know quite a bit about it. You mentioned that some work was done there in the Skunk Works, and a lot of these things were developed there.
There's been, if you do a little bit of research, the Federation of American Scientists have a website, and in fact you can see a picture, an overhead satellite imagery of Groom Lake. It's this dry lake bed that exists about 70 miles north, I believe, west of Las Vegas. A lot of engineers, aerospace engineers, go out there and commute daily from Las Vegas, or some live maybe on the base. It's got an area, it's within an area the size of about Connecticut, and this is where a lot of our top secret military research goes on, particularly for, in fact, the history is shown of the U-2, the SR-71, the Blackbird, which was a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, the B-2 bomber, the F-117 stealth fighter, and a bunch of UAVs, or unmanned aerial vehicles, that are now being produced. What you can do with UAVs is you can loft up whatever you need, send the information back digitally, and if it begins to crash or get taken,
blow it up.
Blow it up. And so a lot of that's being researched out there now.
Well, a big question, though, about Area 51, Dr. Clark, is not so much what airplane is being developed right now, but what's being hidden at Area 51. And we mentioned a moment ago Roswell, but there's a lot of people that are convinced that a spaceship has crashed in the United States and with aliens on board, and these aliens have been transported to a secret place like Area 51. Is it realistic to think that we have alien spacecraft and alien beings in places like Area 51? And is the fact that we don't have proof of that, because there's speculation, of course, a lot in that area, is that in itself proof of a sophisticated cover-up by the government?
Well, that's the way conspiracy theories work. The absence of proof proves how well the conspiracy is working, right? But to take a step back, there are not that many people who actually believe aliens are being held or experimented on. It's a very small fraction of UFO researchers believe that, even those who are pro-UFO phenomena.
And why is that, Mark?
Because it's not credible. For the most part, a lot of the researchers that are putting that forward are not credible. They're not doing credible research. It's way too speculative.
And it discredits the other more
serious
legitimate work that's being done.
Couldn't it also say it's giving way too much credit for our government's ability to hide secrets?
Well, there's the other part. Here's one aerospace engineer who actually worked at Area 51 told me about, say, for example, the B-2 and the F-117. It's been argued by some that those are alien design, right? We copied the alien aircraft and now we've got them. Fiber optics is another one. But what they miss is that those are, and as a physicist you'll know what I'm talking about, these are evolutionary changes, not revolutionary ones. You would think that if it was truly this kind of alien aircraft that had all this technology and all this, we would make a quantum leap or a huge leap in our technology.
This would be a whole different technological paradigm that was introduced. Okay.
The problem is the B-2 has got, if you've ever seen a B-2, it's rounded surfaces, and the F-117s has flat surfaces. Well, why is that? Because they were experimenting with different technologies that were already there from actually 1940s. During World War II, they were concerned about radar detection, and they thought about creating aircraft out of balsa wood, or wood frames. And they could have done it, but they couldn't carry enough equipment and machines. So this idea has been around for a long time, and if you go back to the 60s or the 50s, we had the wing. Remember the flying wing?
Oh, yeah, right.
So that technology has been around.
And these are just small advancements, as it turns
Small,
out.
incremental steps,
rather than the kind of thing you'd expect if it was a whole new technology produced by an alien.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it depends on your perspective. If you were a Japanese, say, general in World War II, and you were not in on their secrets, because they had conducted some research on nuclear weapons, but let's say that you weren't involved in that, you would have been surprised and thought it a revolutionary change when the atomic bomb came on the scene. But to those people who worked all those years diligently on the Manhattan Project, and even physicists that knew about the atomic potential, before that it would have been seen as small incremental evolutionary steps.
Well, what about the government's ability to maintain any conspiracy at all? And this seems to me a concern.
Yeah, that is one of the biggest, I think, myths about this. I mean, if you watch the television shows from the 70s, either the CIA is the most well-organized, conspiratorial, agency in the world, effective,
in world history.
In world history, or the most bumbling, foolish, and you get both perspectives. Why is that? Well, it's part of the absence of information. Again, the government is covering up, and they're doing it not. Again, going back to what I talked about, I talked to different people in the government, and from those who work very seriously on these issues, They're very skittish about talking about these things, but others will talk about it. Tom Clancy's novels are all gotten information gleaned from people that work in government. So you can get the information, and that's the part of the problem. How do you keep this kind of thing secret? You would have to keep it secret between admirals and generals and politicians and Congress, between various agencies, between people who work there, between people who clean the place, janitors, everyone with a vested interest in making a buck off
So
this.
over a long period of time with all these people involved, something's going to slip out that's going to
Absolutely.
conclusively show the conspiracy to be what it is, a cover-up.
Especially in a free society.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, there's a vested interest by the Fourth Estate to expose this. There's a financial reward for all those people involved, and it was over, as you said, over generations. This occurred. How would that secret be kept? No secret I'm aware of. No conspiracy has ever lasted that long.
Well, Dr. Clark, what you're saying, kind of in summary here, is that you're saying the government does actually hide information from us. In that sense, you could say that's a conspiracy, but it's a conspiracy to maintain their security, their national security, but it's not a conspiracy to cover up UFOs. And in fact, such a conspiracy probably wouldn't be able to survive for very long because of all the people that would have a vested interest in exposing this and getting the information out. And if we're...
Greg, I could give you a quick example. The Nixon tape, there was a 20-minute gap.
Yeah.
How successful was Nixon and his administration in covering up that missing 20 minutes? 11 days. So with all the power of the executive branch behind them, they could only hide it for 11 days.
Yeah, so Watergate shows us that conspiracies are not very successful even at the highest levels.
No, and history, international politics shows us that as well. I don't want to belabor it, but the Nazi-Soviet pact in 1939 was a secret cabal between two countries.
Right.
And it gets exposed very soon. Lenin's attempt to take over Russia gets exposed very soon. For any of these things to be successful, you have to let information out to those who can effectuate it. The problem is, as soon as that information gets out to someone, it gets exposed.
Well, then why is it, Dr. Clark, that these unjustified theories seem to have so much life to them?
Well, I think worldwide there's been conspiracy theories all throughout human history. But in America, there's a particular kind of political culture that foments this, I think, even further. Since the Revolutionary War, we've divided our government into three competing agencies. And since Watergate, now we've had the Fourth Estate believes its job, the press believes its job is to check and find out what Hugh talked about earlier about Nixon's cover-up. To test the government, make sure it's telling the truth. And people born of that era, Chris Carter, the producer of the X-Files, talks about that and says, I was born of the Watergate era, and so he distrusts government.
So it's almost part of the national consciousness now to believe conspiracy theories because of recent historical events that have fed into this
JFK assassination, World War II, and all that.
Yeah, that's true of other nations as well.
Yes.
Russia's a prime example where their past history feeds into this mentality that there must be a gigantic government cover-up of UFOs.
Dr. Ross, we want to draw on your expertise now as an astronomer, and we'd like you to comment on some recent NASA footage that has captured what seems to be some pretty strong evidence that lends credibility to the idea that ships are hovering over the Earth here in our atmosphere. Our viewers may be familiar with this incident, they're called tether incident actually, where NASA astronauts lost a gas-filled tether floating off in space, and the cameras are recording this, and then it seems like a team of about 50 UFOs begin to hover around this tether, examining it, whatever. That's the way it appears. And we're going to take a moment and we'll see the video clip here, and I'll let you respond to it.
Okay. Now this rod that you see here is the tether of the spacecraft, and you can see that there are some objects, particularly here. There's a bunch of little objects that seem to be clustering around the tether. There's a spheroid there, kind of looks like an amoeba.
It looks like a parachute or a jellyfish or something.
And so you see this stuff streaming by. This seems to be making an approach, different directions, but notice that it's all spherical type shapes. And this would be typical if there's some kind of gas or fluid release. And after all, this was a broken tether, and the tether was filled with gases and fluids. There's even an incident where the astronauts release some urine into outer space. You can get a similar thing.
You get a similar effect from water, any kind of water or liquids being...
In the vacuum of outer space, you're going to get all these little spheroids.
So what you're saying, Dr. Ross, is that chances are this is going to turn out to be an IFO, an identified flying object.
Well, it's at least an identifiable flying object. There's a possibility that we can identify everything we saw here in this clip with something that would be natural or man-originated.
Okay, well, there's another NASA clip that doesn't look like it performs in a way that's man-made. Let's take a look at that clip.
Sure. Yes, you see this object taking a right-angled turn or a near right-angled turn. Notice the second one doesn't do that. But hey, if you take a second look at this, you can see that just where that right-angled turn is occurring, the whole planet Earth shifts. So clearly this is a camera movement, not the actual...
That's what I was going to ask you, because I know in high-altitude reconnaissance, when NEMA, National Imaging and Mapping Agency, looks at things, they have to take into account the angle that they take the picture from, the shadow cast and all that. But if you have a camera moving at the time of it, it's going to cause a physical, an apparent change.
Right.
Well, is that what that's what it looked like in
obviously
this.
the camera moved because you got the whole planet Earth shifting over. And
yeah, it was rotating real fast, and all of a sudden it stopped. And then the second one shows it, and it doesn't make that move.
When the second one comes, you don't see that.
In other words, this right-angle movement that the first object appears to make is perfectly timed with the change in that that aspect of the Earth we see in the photo. So there could be an explanation here that there's a distortion of some sort that we see in the Earth, and also therefore is affecting the way that first object looks, and the second one doesn't have such distortion, and that's why we see a more understandable trail there.
Yeah, and both of these clips demonstrate that the UFO investigator must be aware of the environment of the situation, and also must be aware of what was responsible for taking the image. Every camera, whether it be optical or radar or whatever, is going to have ghost images in it, and so you have to be able to deal with that as well. But in showing these clips, we're not saying that there isn't evidence for sharp right-angle turns. I mean, there are clear examples where you see these fast-moving flying objects making very sudden stops or starts or right-angle turns, and these would be the R UFOs, those that would not be identifiable with natural or man-made phenomena. But this is a case where people thought they were RF UFOs.
So this is one of those, arguably, one of those 95 to 98% of the cases where we have an odd phenomenon that actually does have a legitimate explanation. Though, as you pointed out, there still are those RUFOs, those residual UFO sightings that do this kind of thing, and they can't be accounted for by camera movement or something like that.
Some people would classify what we saw here as an RUFO, but the authors of this book, myself included, would not. I mean, we take a much more restrictive,
more skeptical, in a sense, properly skeptical approach. Well, let's sum up our response so far to this second hypothesis, the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And it seems you've outlined three different problems that we have with this. The first one is that the chances of finding any planet capable of supporting extraterrestrial life, that in itself is a problem, okay? Can there be extraterrestrial life out there? The second problem, if there is extraterrestrial life, how is it going to get here? And then we talked about the problems with space travel and the like. And the third thing has to do with government conspiracies. And Dr. Clark, you pointed out that all this government conspiracy response has some serious problems, and a lot of things, when you look at it now with hindsight and declassification, those things can be resolved. But the fact remains, of course, that we have some credible evidence for these RUFOs. They do in fact exist, and that perhaps a third explanation will work to answer all of the facts.
Or even an adjustment of that third explanation.
Okay. Well, this explanation has to somehow account for the fact that these RUFOs are real, but also that they exhibit some of the non-physical properties that we talked about in the first episode. And Hugh, this brings us to the topic of our final segment together. In that segment, we'll explore the third hypothesis to explain these residual UFOs. It's called the extra-dimensional hypothesis. Could these RUFOs be visitors from another dimension? Do these alien beings want to help us discover the meaning of life and bring peace on Earth? Do they possess a higher wisdom? We'll explore these questions and more next time. Thank you for joining us.
for a missing 2 hours of time. In the days and months to follow, they were plagued by physical problems and nightmares associated with suppressed memories of an alien abduction. November 5th, 1975, 6 men reported that their colleague disappeared when he approached a UFO. 5 days later, he was found alone, dehydrated, and mentally disturbed. He recounted experiences of being examined by strange creatures. Reported cases of abductions like these number in the thousands, and the effects are always the same. Whether damage to plants and animals, psychological injury, and even physical death, trauma of some kind always results from close encounters with our UFOs. But another puzzling component is the ability of UFO craft to defy the laws of physics. Objects have been reported to make sharp right-angle turns at high speeds. They have also been observed to suddenly change form, disintegrate, and then reappear, among other strange phenomena. Appeals to physical explanations, such as government cover-ups and the existence of extraterrestrials, seem to provide an inadequate solution. How can these UFOs be both real in light of the trauma they inflict and non-physical due to the unusual properties they exhibit? In this final episode, we explore the possibility of extra-dimensional beings as the basis for a viable UFO hypothesis.
Welcome once again to this special edition of Reasons to Believe. This is the final episode in our series in which we've been discussing the UFO hypothesis. Now, our panel of experts has been developing a theory that best fits the facts surrounding UFOs and offers a unique approach to this difficult problem. I'm your host, Greg Kokel, and I'm joined today by astronomer and minister and UFO investigator, Dr. Hugh Ross. Hugh?
Good to be with you, Greg.
In addition to Dr. Ross, joining us is cult researcher and Christian theologian and philosopher, Ken Samples. Ken?
Hello, Greg.
Good to have you back. Now, both of you, along with Dr. Mark Clark, are co-authors of a book entitled Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men, A Rational Christian Look at UFOs and Extraterrestrials. It's published by NAB Press, and our viewers may want to get a hold of that book if they want more information about what we're discussing here in our series. Just to briefly recap what we've covered so far, we began our series by discussing your theory that the vast majority of UFO sightings have an explanation of one kind or another. That is, natural explanation of Venus, sightings of military aircraft, or hallucinations, or hoaxes, or something like that. We dispatched the large majority of those, but still there's a percentage that haven't been explained yet. 1 to 5%, which is a rather large number, as it turns out. And we've called these UFOs, or residual UFOs. Well, gentlemen, is there a common denominator here, or an element which seems to be consistent across the board throughout all of these residual UFO reports that can help us to understand them better? Ken?
Well, there certainly is, Greg. What I call a prerequisite of occultism. Virtually all the people who engage in UFO phenomena and UFO experience frequently have roots in the occult, involved in some kind of mediumship, what is called trans-channeling, seeking esoteric knowledge, trying to predict the future. People sometimes describe even experiencing levitation, poltergeist phenomena, things of that nature. And out of this occult experience comes 2 other elements that I think are very important. One, a real sense of deception, that these entities, whatever they are very deceptive about their nature. They're deceptive about communicating ideas. And often people are left with harm. They're harmed mentally, emotionally, psychologically, sometimes physically, and almost always spiritually harmed by taking them away from various reality and truth.
Just to take this a little farther, Ken, sometimes these are characterized, we see on TV and in movies and stuff, and and even a testimony from some of these promoting these contacts, that these aliens are really our friends. They're trying to help us. They're trying to take us to the next stage of human evolution. So there's a benevolence that's characterized here. You're saying that really is mistaken.
It's true that there are people who claim a benevolence, that these so-called aliens are here to help humanity take that next step in evolution or to avoid disaster. However, when you begin to look at the residual UFOs, you've cleared away all the others, you begin to see that there is these elements of deception and this occult influence, and that people are harmed. For everyone who says that they're helped by these, there are many who are harmed.
In what way are they harmed?
Sometimes it is severe emotional trauma, psychological trauma. There are accounts of people actually being physically harmed, even killed. And other people go through a very difficult period where they're attempting to recover from this kind of thing. Not to mention what I would call the spiritual negative influences out of this kind of phenomena.
Sometimes the malevolence gets worse as the days follow the experience. I mean, if it was something natural going on, you'd expect the greatest trauma to be at the time of the event. But in many of these residual UFO experiences, it actually gets worse and worse as time goes by. Months later, the trauma is even worse than it was the following day.
So there's this characteristic malevolence when you get down to the RUFO segment, basically, that needs to be accounted for, I guess is what you're saying, and it harms the people, and it actually, instead of improving the circumstances as time goes on, it actually gets worse, as you're saying.
Well, a significant piece of data that supports this is, like, you take my discipline of astronomy. Some of us are outside observing the heavens for 1,000 hours plus a year. If anybody should be seeing UFOs, given that it has some kind of natural explanation, we should be seeing them because we're out there watching most. And UFOs tend to peak at 3 a.m. in the morning. Well, the people who are out there watching the sky at 3 a.m. should be seeing these things. Another thing you note is that UFOs are most frequent along remote, lonely roads. Well, that's where astronomers are observing. But it's not the astronomers with the most observing time that are having these RUFO encounters. Rather, it's the astronomers that are the most deeply involved in occult practices that are having these experiences. I noticed that there were men in my peer group who were maybe observing 3 or 4 hours a year. And they were consistently having RUFO experiences, where others of us who were logging 1,500 hours plus per year never had these experiences. Well, in the first group, you had people who were deeply involved or committed to occult activities. In the second group, they were not involved in those activities at all.
I'd like to get some clarification on this, Hugh, because I think a lot of times people hear the word occult and they think of satanic rituals. They think, well, I'm not involved in satanic rituals, so I'm not involved in the occult. Now, Ken gave a couple of examples of occult activity. Can you expand this a little bit more so we can get an idea of what kinds of things people are involved
Well, it's what
with?
Ken was saying, trying to seek some supernatural knowledge, being able to predict the future or being able to see.
Tarot cards, would that be an example?
Tarot cards, astrology, going to a seance, playing with a Ouija board, reading occult literature, or reading material written by fortune tellers and people who claim to be prophets and seers. Having sexual intercourse with a witch or someone who's involved in these activities. These would all be open doors to the occult. And statistically, at least in our studies, people don't have these residual UFO encounters unless they have one or more of these open doors. And the more open doors there are, the more likely they are to have these experiences. I mean, one of the things you see in the literature is that UFOs are prone to revisit people.
And what comes out of that typically, Greg, is that people end up being more involved, becoming drawn to the occult, having a deeper involvement in kind of an occult worldview. And rather than coming
because of their RUFO experience.
Because of this experience. And because of those experiences, they don't come closer to knowing the reality of this phenomenon. at its heart, it becomes even more deceptive. So the closer one is connected to this experience, we see this harm, we see deception, and we see an occult worldview.
Okay, so I asked the question first, is there any common denominator here that ties all of these UFO experiences together? And you said, first of all, that there's a malevolent factor. I mean, bad things happen to people that are involved here, and there is this connection with the occult that is very consistent across the board. You even called it, Ken, a prerequisite almost to people who have UFO experiences. Well, this suggests an interdimensional factor that you raised in past sessions, Dr.
Well,
Ross.
let me throw out another factor before we move on to that, and that is there's a lot of non-random characteristics to these residual UFOs. The fact that they prefer 3 a.m. in the morning to other times of the day, lonely roads as opposed to heavily populated areas. The fact that the science that they communicate seems to be just slightly ahead of that of the layman. I mean, their facts about our solar system and our galaxy and our universe seem to be incorrect.
In other words, what they communicate to people when they're allegedly talking to people,
right?
They're not as smart as you'd think they should be.
Well, I mean, their science is not up to the level of graduate school astronomy and physics, but it is right about the level of high school or undergraduate level science and astronomy, but it keeps getting better and better as we learn more and more.
So the rank and file would be impressed by this, so you realize that they're really not that technologically advanced in the information they're giving.
Right. I mean, we're getting into this interdimensional thing that
It's suspicious.
It's suspicious that they don't know as much about the universe as we already know. Moreover, their knowledge seems to be advancing at the same pace that our knowledge is advancing. And even the UFO phenomena, I mean, it started off 100 years ago being slow-moving dirigibles, then fast-moving craft, moving as fast as the speed of sound. Now they're going at 15,000 miles per hour. So the fact that it's keeping pace with our technology and keeping pace for a level of science knowledge, but never accurate, makes me suspicious about what their real motive is. And I think it gives some additional evidence for what Ken is saying. There's really a deception going on, because they seem to tailor their message to the audience that's receiving it.
Dr. Ross, I'm a little confused on the connection. I understand that you say their technology here is behind the times where it ought to be if they're ETs. This is suspicious. Can you give us some more illustrations and show the real significance of that to your view?
Yeah, sure can. Remember we were talking about 100 years ago, these spaceships were dirigibles? Well, the beings on board, so-called beings, were claiming to be visitors from the moon. And then when human society reached a point where they recognized the moon is not a possible location for ET.
It's not made of green cheese.
It's not made of green cheese. And they said, well, we're from Venus. And then when they discovered that the temperatures on the surface of Venus are 800 degrees, then their story became, well, we're from Mars. And when that was no longer credible, well, we're from the moons of Jupiter and Saturn.
And this is following right along our technological understanding.
Right. Now they're saying they're from some distant star system because we've been able to rule out the solar system as a possible location for ET. So the fact that they're connecting with the level of our human education, technology, and understanding gives support for the idea that they're really intent on deceiving us. And they try to connect with the people at that time. I mean, if they're really, technologically advanced creatures, you would expect their science knowledge to be accurate. The fact that it's always just a little bit ahead of the average layperson makes us suspicious that they've got another motive in mind, namely to connect with the audience and to deceive them.
So it's starting to sound like a con job a little bit here as you're looking more and more at the details.
Well, when you look at the abduction experience, where a person is taken against their will on a craft, and typically scientific experiments are done on the medical procedures. Greg, they're very crude in nature. They don't seem to operate as if they're an advanced civilization, a noble civilization. Their scientific, so-called scientific messages don't jive with good science. So again, a deceptive nature seems to be prevalent.
Well, this brings us at an important juncture in our conversation, because given the three theories here, we've really amassed a tremendous amount of persuasive evidence that the first two theories are not adequate to account for our UFOs. That brings us to the threshold of a third theory that you propose to explain our UFOs, and that is the extra-dimensional hypothesis. What do you see as being the main strengths of this theory? Can you give us the strengths after you describe specifically what it is?
Well, the strengths are that there is this mountain of evidence that the cause is non-physical, and yet it's real. There are physical effects. And therefore it seems to speak of some kind of entity that's not confined or restrained by the 10 space-time dimensions of the universe. They have the capacity to invade our space-time dimensions, but they're not limited by our space-time dimensions. So in that sense, they're extra-dimensional entities. And that, of course, leads to the whole idea, do we have any physical evidence that that is even a realistic possibility? Mm-hmm. And this is where the astrophysics of the past 30 years, I think, is significant in challenging this naturalist paradigm that everything that is real is physical. You can appeal to the space-time theorems of general relativity, which simply state that if the theory of general relativity is a correct explanation of the dynamics of the universe, then the cause of the universe must bring the entire universe into existence, independent of matter, energy, and all the space-time dimensions associated with matter and energy.
Well, let's pause there for a moment, because this is a very important point you're making, and I just want to revisit it just a little bit. Basically, what you're saying is that science itself demonstrates that there's something outside of science. That is, something outside
there's
of nature.
Something beyond physical reality. Something beyond nature.
Because some people are going to say, well, how can science discover the non-physical world? Science wasn't meant to do that. And you're saying even the foundational theorems of general relativity demonstrate that nature came from somewhere that wasn't nature.
Correct.
And so just in that, we've got a very strong indication that something is outside of science, and this hypothesis draws upon that scientific understanding that there's more here than meets the eye in the naturalistic world.
And see, the skeptic is now forced into denying the theory of general relativity. And what's interesting about the past 2 years of physics research is that general relativity has now become the best proven, most exhaustively tested principle in all of physics. So given that we're forced to accept the reality of general relativity, we're also forced to accept the fact that the cause of the universe is a transcendent entity or a transcendent being.
Well,
therefore, non-physical reality must exist.
Right, right. So, I mean, this is a tremendous statement that you're making here when you think about it, because up until now, a lot of people have simply thought that science, by its very nature, has limited our knowledge to the physical realm. And what you're saying is, in the case of UFOs, that knowledge of the physical realm disqualifies a fully physical explanation of the UFOs. Well, and in fact, the science necessarily pushes us beyond that. We have scientific justification now for reaching into this extra-dimensional world for an explanation.
Well, science studies the universe, which is really the physical effect. But knowledge of the physical effect implies something about the cause of the physical effect. And we can now demonstrate that that causal agent transcends the physical realm. And earlier in this series we talked about the anthropic principle. And when you really get down to the nuts and bolts of the anthropic principle, the fine-tuning is so extreme that it cannot be attributed to any physical entity within the universe. It's too great. It speaks about a being more powerful than the universe itself to explain that in a huge level of design. And so the space-time theorems of general relativity, combined with this anthropic principle, the evidence that the universe has been exquisitely designed to make human life possible in this narrow window of time, both speak of the reality of something beyond the physics of the universe. Now, I think what makes us helpful in trying to identify residual UFOs, it also establishes that of all the philosophical and theological works over the past several thousand years that deal with non-physical reality, the only message from that great body of works that's consistent with these new discoveries in physics and astronomy are the pages of the Bible. So what this does is it gives us some confidence of what the Bible says about non-physical reality compared to other religious holy books is reliable. Therefore, should we trust what the Quran's got to say or the Hindu Vedas? Well, no, because their statements about non-physical reality are contradicted by what the scientists are discovering. But what these scientists have discovered tells us that the Bible was ahead of the time by thousands of years in describing these characteristics of the universe. Therefore, its message can be trusted when it speaks of non-physical reality.
So what you're saying is science has justified the claim now that there is a reality outside of nature.
Right.
Indirectly has demonstrated that, as you pointed out. We have to take that seriously. And that allows us to go, in a sense, outside of science to find some other kinds of explanations for these phenomena. The books of the world, of those holy books, there's only one that really fits with everything we know about science and does help us to explain these kinds of things in a consistent way.
Correct. So it gives us some confidence that we can trust the message of the Bible as it speaks about non-physical reality. And that's important because it leads us to the recognition there is more in the non-physical realm than the creator of the universe. That creator, according to the Bible, has created beings that are not confined to the space-time realm of the cosmos, calls them angels. These beings are not as powerful as God, but they're certainly more powerful than we human beings. And they have access to dimensions or geography that we don't and nothing in the universe does.
Well, I'm especially impressed, and I hope the viewers are seeing this, the careful methodology that you're using to get to this point. You're using the scientific evidence and the possible theories that are out there, and just by a process of elimination, which theories are best supported by the facts, and what are the possibilities. And here, the possibility that you're offering in this third explanation of the RUFO hypothesis is one that is maybe new to people, but is fully supported and consistent with what we've been learning about science. Now, I think a question is going to come into mind to people here because, Ken, you earlier made the connection between the occult and a lot of these sightings, and now we see how that can fit together a little bit in this extra-dimensional aspect of your answer. But what about the person who says, you know, listen, I've seen UFOs, and I've never been involved in the occult?
Well, there's a couple things that I think need to be said in that context. It's possible they saw an IFO. That is, what they saw really does have a natural explanation.
An identified flying object.
An identified flying object.
Or an identifiable flying object. Maybe it hasn't been identified with something specific, but it's something that at least has the possibility of being identified with something physical or man-made.
It may also be, Greg, that people may have a very limited awareness of how one could experience the occult. There are people who think that, well, I've never been to a seance, therefore I have no connection to occultism at all. They, however, may be involved in astrology. They may be involved in any number of areas that they're not aware that could, in fact, involve some kind of occult experience. So one needs to be careful before you draw the conclusion that everybody who sees these things is in the occult. But there are some reasonable questions to be asked.
So Ken here, occult then would cover, by definition, what?
Well, occultism would involve the belief in these hidden practices, these esoteric beliefs, beliefs and practices that are forbidden by God, that could involve anything from being a medium to predicting the future, to any number of kind
secret
of
knowledge.
Encounters, secret knowledge.
Divination, all of
Divination,
that.
yes.
Well, Ken, if your theory is correct, and these UFOs are the result of interdimensional beings, the Bible has a word for these things. They're called demons, or angels would be another type of interdimensional
Fallen
being.
angels.
You're talking about,
fallen angels,
in this case, the malevolent version of that. How should we respond? I mean, how should we think about these kinds of things?
Greg and Ken, this is a wonderful opportunity, speaking as a scientist, to put this whole interpretation we're proposing to the test. You know, people say, well, I've seen UFOs, but I'm not involved in the occult. Well, let's take you through a little questionnaire. Let's really make sure that your UFO is a residual UFO. And let's check into your background a little bit to see what's really going on. You know, one of the things I've been doing for the past 25 years, and I speak on this subject, is that people say, well, I'm outside of your box. I say, show me your data. The fact that it's completely consistent with the interpretation we're offering, I think, is a wonderful test that this is the way to go. For example, we would expect that in nations where there's more occult activity, there will be more residual UFO experiences. This is borne out in the database. And if anybody's a skeptic, let's just wait a little bit and take in a few more RFU reports that are current and see where the data lies. So we don't have to fight over this whole thing. We can just put it to the test. I mean, what we're saying is there is a correlation here. And if we continue to study this phenomenon, the correlation will get stronger and stronger. If it gets weaker, we're wrong. But if it gets stronger, we're right.
But there's another piece of evidence that we haven't talked about at all, but it seems to fit in nicely at this point, and that is theology of those being channeled, or the UFO contactees. And this also seems to tie in. Ken, tell us about that.
Well, it's interesting, Greg, that the people who receive these messages, channel these messages, the so-called books, the Urantia book, various other writings that are claimed to be messages from these so-called alien beings, virtually all of them are anti-Christian in their theological orientation. Jesus is not the only Lord and Savior of mankind. Belief in pluralism, truth is found in many religions. There is not an absolute morality and truth. It's relative in nature. So there is a movement of criticism toward a biblical worldview, but also belief in multiple gods, belief in magic, a belief that one can predict the future. In many ways, a New Age or mystical spirituality emerges from these kinds of things. So first of all, it is distinctly anti-Christian.
Ken, is it fair to say that these messages, these communications and books tend to have a negative message more than they have a positive message? In other words, that their content is really aimed at knocking down the doctrines of the Christian faith rather than kind of promoting their own?
Well, there really is, and that is unique. It's very distinctly anti-Christian. Then it starts to develop, again, this kind of Eastern mystical monism and pantheism. But there's also an interesting connection. The Bible and Christian theology speaks of these angels who are fallen, the demonic. They're real, they're intelligent, they're powerful, and they're malevolent. The corresponding element is very common, and Hugh, as you know, a number of ufologists, credible people who study UFO phenomena, have suggested that there is a direct parallel between UFO phenomena and what ancient Christianity called demonology. And that's not just Christians making that claim.
So you're connecting the dots now. You're saying here are all these characteristics, including the malevolent nature, the extra-dimensional nature, the theological elements. And there's a sense in which you're saying that these are all the kinds of things we'd expect to see if the Bible is correct on its view of the supernatural, including the inhabitants of the supernatural. And they were using this circumstance as part of a kind of a theological battle of sorts. Is that a fair way of putting it?
It's a fair way of putting it, and you could also add that it's consistent with who sees these residual UFOs and who does not see these residual UFOs. I think it's also fair, Ken, that the database, those that are the most heavily involved in the occult are the ones most likely to have the close encounters of the second, third, and fourth kind, as opposed to those who only have encounters of the first kind.
There really is a prerequisite. One must take that next step of occultism to have these deep, intimate interactions with UFO beings.
Well, gentlemen, we've covered a lot of ground here in the last couple sessions, and I think as we close out this session, it might be a good idea to sum up a little bit what the whole argument looks like, because, Dr. Ross, you are offering a careful analysis of a problem, and you're offering also a credible solution to that problem. How does that fit together?
Yeah, we're taking a testable scientific approach to the problem of UFOs. And we've looked at the three traditional explanations for residual UFOs. Those are the UFOs that don't have an easily identifiable explanation. And we noted that the idea that it's some kind of unexplained physical mechanism like Earth lights doesn't match the database, neither do the extraterrestrial hypothesis, because there you're appealing to a naturalistic explanation. And as we've summarized, there's a huge body of evidence that these residual UFOs violate the laws of physics. So it's something beyond physical reality. And this brought us into the interdimensional, the extra-dimensional hypothesis, and we critiqued why appealing to multiverse or something between the dimensions or the 6 small dimensions of the 10 physical dimensions of the universe won't work. It really is something coming from beyond the 10 space-time dimensions of the universe, non-physical reality. And then for those skeptics who say, well, non-physical reality is impossible, we need to remind them that theoretical physics and astrophysics has clearly established that non-physical reality is part of the scientific tool base, in the sense that you have things like the space-time theorems of general relativity, which state that if general relativity is true, then there must be an entity beyond matter, energy, space, and time that's responsible for bringing the universe into existence. By definition, that's non-physical reality. We talked about the anthropic principle, the design of the universe, the design of the solar system that's necessary to explain our existence, and how the extremely high level of that design defies any physical or natural explanation. But I think what's critical is that all this new evidence from science about non-physical reality is uniquely consistent with the message of the words of the Bible. If you look at what the Hindus or the Buddhists or the Muslims have to say about non-physical reality, it's either contradictory or inaccurate, contrasted with this new scientific evidence. But what the Bible says is accurate and reliable and consistent. Moreover, it was stated thousands of years, 3,500 years ago, the Bible made these statements about the universe, which scientists are now discovering to be true.
And part of what it says is that there's this extra-dimensional reality that has not only God in it, but these other personalities that have a malevolent impact on the earth and could help us explain the UFOs.
Yeah, the Bible speaks about God creating angels, extra-dimensional beings, not omnipresent and all-powerful like He is. They're limited like we are, but they're not as limited. We're limited to the space-time realm of His universe. They are not. And the Bible tells us that they fall into 2 categories, the righteous angels and the malevolent or the evil angels.
Ken, why should we take this hypothesis seriously, in your view?
Well, Greg, this is a difficult topic, and we have attempted in our book to take a careful and credible approach to create an explanatory hypothesis. We're not suggesting that we can answer every single thing, but we have suggested that this hypothesis, in fact, is clear, it's consistent, it has real explanatory power and scope, it fits the facts.
And it makes predictions about what people should discover in the future as they continue this research.
It's superior to these other theories because it has these explanatory elements. And finally, it corresponds to Scripture. Thus, this hypothesis that there is a residual group of UFOs, they're real, they're not physical, they're malevolent, and that they correspond to what the Christian Scriptures refer to as the demonic.
So there you have it, a provocative problem, provocative ideas, and a provocative solution. You know, if this video series has sparked your interest to learn more about the Christian faith, then we invite you to visit the Reasons to Believe website. Here's the address, reasons.org. Now, Reasons to Believe is a nonprofit organization dedicated to giving a rational defense for the truth of Christianity. And all of the participants of this program hope that you will dedicate yourself to the pursuit of truth. And we firmly believe that all religious claims should be rigorously tested. And when you are careful and test them, in the end, only the truth will be left standing. Thank you for joining us.